which was baloney. It was baloney. They weren't protecting Israel. They were landing. And they didn't want anybody to report that because they didn't want the Iraqis to know where they were landing. And it reshaped the mentality, in a sense, of what Israel could and couldn't do in terms of using a military. And they began to see that a different solution was necessary. And for the Palestinians, for Yasser Arafat, like I said, with the Palestinians so into what Saddam Hussein said, he embraced Saddam Hussein, and the media saw the pictures, and the Saudis said, who were part of that war, because they thought Iraq was coming after them, after Kuwait, right? And the Kuwaitis and the Saudis said, "You gonna go give a kiss to Saddam Hussein like that? All you Palestinians who are working in the Gulf countries as accountants and as managers in our, it's a very modern economy. Those are rich countries. They have malls and drive Buicks, and they all got thrown out of Kuwait, right? They got thrown. The Palestinian community, huge Palestinian community, got thrown out of Kuwait, and it was like that was a community where the money was coming from for the PLO and groups, and it was a huge blow. And Arafat was drowning at that moment. Okay.
You mentioned it earlier that, back in '67 that Egypt and all these places lost the wars and everything else, and that Jordan made all the Palestinians Jordanian citizens. Then isn't that in part messing around with state sovereignty? And shouldn't all the Palestinians be either pushed into Jordan so that Israel gets all of Jerusalem, all the West Bank, and everything else, and then, or since Jordan kicked them out to Lebanon, should they just be forced up there? And then, wouldn't that basically take care of the problem? Because even if Kuwait doesn't want Palestinians, or Egypt doesn't want them.
I got your question. There are 4 million Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories. About 3 million in the occupied territories and about 1.2 or something like that as Israeli citizens. To move those people, that's called ethnic cleansing. Okay? So some people agree with you that that's the solution. Kick all the Palestinians out. That's a bloodbath. You're not going to get people to leave their homes unless you start massacring them. That's how you do it. So in some sense it's a solution, but it's a horrible solution in my opinion, right? It's a bloody, murderous solution that would force 4 million people, make them as refugees. So I don't think more ethnic cleansing is necessarily that solution. So the Gulf War pushed both sides to this moment, right? Where Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin got together and they said, okay, we can't solve the big issues. What are the big issues? Jerusalem, settlements, and refugees, right? We can't agree. But let's create some interim arrangement, and after 5 years, we'll learn to like each other. And then we'll deal with the big issues, right? That was the idea of the interim Oslo Agreement. And it set up this map, Oslo II, Second Agreement, 1995. It was Jericho and Gaza first, and then this. And what it did was it took the West Bank and it divided it into 3 different areas. So you have the hatch mark areas, or these diagonal stripes here, right? These are Zone A, okay? And in these areas, the PLO was allowed to return and set up a Palestinian Authority. So they were going to be responsible for everything, for the health, for the welfare, for the education, for the sanitation, and for security. So Palestinian police came back. And those are the main population areas. Then there's Zone B, the black areas. And that's where there are still Palestinians living. There's still populated areas. But those were going to be where the Palestinians had civil authority, education, sanitation, that kind of stuff. But security was going to be joint. And in those years, we saw Palestinian police and Israeli police patrolling in 2 streets together, right? For a few years there. They were cooperating. The rest of the areas, all in white, there was going to be no Palestinian Authority. That was still going to be under Israeli occupation, where there was no civil or security authority for the PA. This was supposed to be an interim agreement. The little squares represent settlements. So you can see that there are the squares don't show you which ones are the big settlements and which ones are the little settlements, right? But you can see there's a settlement block here. This is Tel Aviv, main city. So commuters go out here to one of the largest settlements, Ariel, and it sort of cuts this northern part of the West Bank from this central part. And then there's a huge block of settlements. The largest one is Ma'ale Adumim, right here east of Jerusalem. And this block of settlements sort of divides the West Bank into 3 large areas and many little areas. Let's see, my next slide is. Okay. So this Oslo agreement was meant to be interim. And there were good things about Oslo. There were good things. You know, it was really good. When I started doing my graduate field work in the early 90s, it was before the Palestinian Authority had come into, I was working in Tulkarem, in this, right here, you can barely read it. It says Tulkarem right there. I was in a village just outside of Tulkarem, between Tulkarem and this town, Nablus. And in those days, you go into Tulkarem, and at night, it was silent. Nobody went out at night. I went out at night. Because the army would stop me, and I'd pull out my American passport, and it was something to write about, you know. But Palestinians were really scared to go out at night, and you'd go out, nobody was out. You hear a car coming, and you wanted to sort of duck away because it was likely to be an Israeli jeep coming, and you didn't want to be caught by Israelis at that time. Nothing was open downtown after dark. Once Oslo came, the Israelis pulled out of those Zone A's, and downtown Nablus, and downtown Tulkarem, downtown Ramallah came to life, and that was really good. And people could take their kids out to ice cream, in the evening, in the summer, and so that was all really good. But what happened was the army pulled out to the edges of town, and they set up new checkpoints. And although things were better in town, the towns became more divided from each other. So now, if you wanted to travel from one town to another, you had to pass at least 2 checkpoints, right? And those checkpoints became more serious and made life, in many ways, more difficult. And you see here, how these zones were all cut up, and this is a better map, shows you the growth of these settlements, Ariel, Ma'ale Adumim. You also see what I showed you on this side, which is that Palestinians who had been working for years in Israel started to have trouble going to work. And at first, in March 1993, they set up checkpoints on the Green Line, and they started to enforce insurance papers, but then it became security papers. And these are pictures of Palestinians sneaking in the back roads. In 1993, you could just sort of walk around the checkpoint, at times. Israelis wouldn't let you go through the checkpoint. That would make you sort of too legal. But you could go around the checkpoint, and people were sneaking in. It became more and more difficult to get to work in Israel. And closure started to become a serious problem and started to become a frustrating daily life in this period. And this is when I was doing, some of my early field work throughout the 90s, and that's crossing the Green Line. That is the Green Line. You're seeing them cross. That's my book from 2002, which describes I went to work in construction and agriculture and did that and snuck across the border with Palestinians and built homes and snuck back at the end of the day and wrote about the impact of policing on daily life. What did it do to your relationship with your contractor, with your business employee? What did it do to relationships inside the West Bank? How did this shape daily life? You can read that book if you want to hear more. Okay. Now, this period not only got bad economically in that way, but it was racked by violence, okay? And although some people were like, oh, this is going to be peace, other people said, no way, we're not going to make this settlement, and violence was stepped up in this period. And one of the the first big signs that this was going wrong was what sometimes called the Purim Massacre, February 1994, not far into Oslo, when this guy, Baruch Goldstein, went into a mosque in Hebron and opened fire with an automatic weapon, an Israeli settler, and killed about 24 Palestinians and injured like 100 more. And he was killed right there on the spot. There's his grave, and you can see that some people, there are other photos of his grave where they have a lot of stones on it, which is something Jews do when you go visit a grave. You sort of bring a stone as a sign, I guess, that you've been there and visited it, a sign of something. It's covered with stones. It's a place of pilgrimage for some people. So although many would say he was a criminal, some would venerate him and build him that grave. This event hit the Palestinians, really was